Hi, friends, and welcome to the Figma for EDU monthly workshop. My name is Miggy. I'm joined by Alex. Today, we're going to talk about typography variables and modes in Figma design. We're going to also demonstrate the purpose of using variables and creating consistency in your file, as well as talk about dev mode and the handoff of not only using variables and styles in your design for that consistency across your design, but what that's going to look like when you share that with a developer and for the developer to understand how to work through it. Or if you're developing your own designs, just creating that consistency for yourself and structuring that appropriately throughout your designs, whether you're publishing out as a library for use in other files, or you're just looking for that consistency within that single file yourself. All right, there's an extra slide there. Let's just remove that. And we're going to get started and we're going to talk briefly about what variables are in Figma. In previous workshops, we've done kind of sessions talking about advanced prototyping with variables. So variables are used to create this consistency. You can create a color variable, a number variable, a string variable, and a Boolean variable. And now we're going to talk about what that means with typography. You're going to look over here in the top right, and we are by design, starting with a file that has no variables included. We're going to create some typography variables together. Going to go through that step by step. I didn't want you all to be overburdened by seeing a file entirely littered. And what I mean by that is I'll show you a file that has a bunch of typography variables applied where it can feel overwhelming if you're not building this out as an individual. And if this is an introduction to you. So we're starting off with a blank canvas and I'm going to build those out together. So when you go to the variable palette, once again, you're going to notice I'm here in Figma's redesigned UI 3. When I click on the canvas, I'm clicking on the canvas that's any gray area in this file. I'm going to hop over here to the right. I'm going to see my local variables, and these are variables that are going to be created inside of this file. Now, what a variable will do is control, you know, and keep consistent anything that you have here. And basically, let's create our first variable. I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a text field. I'm going to press the letter T. I'm going to click on my canvas. I'm just going to type in the words hello world onto this text field, right? And so with this text field here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ascribe a variable to it. So I'm going to click on the canvas. I'm going to come up here to local variables. I'm going to click on that. And here I'm going to create my very first variable. I'm going to come down here and I'm going to create a string variable. A string variable is just plain text, right? So color is a color, a number is a number, Boolean means true or false, string just means a plain piece of text. And what we're going to do is we're going to edit and maintain that here in this variables panel. So here in my variables panel, you'll notice, you'll see this collection that has been created. So I'm going to click on more options. I'm going to rename this and I'm just going to say first example. So this collection of variables, right now, it's going to seem like a little confusing. You're like, wait, why am I creating this collection? I just created one. You're going to start to see the value of collections over time as you start to create more variables. So in this first example, I'm going to create a string value. For every variable, you have a name and a value. So what is the name here? We're going to call this we're just going to call this, uh, uh, our first text variable, first text variable. We're just going to be so literal with this variable. And then we're going to ascribe it a value. Now, this string value is any plain text. It can be several words. It can be spaces. So what I'm going to say here is I'm going to say, hello, Figma community, right? And I'm going to put in an exclamation point. So now anything that has that first text variable, I'm going to put in some underscores here just so you can really see that that is the first text variable. I'm going to click this text field here. And now this text field, what I can do is I can click up here in the top right. You'll notice that this text property, we're going to see some other things here. This is going to be that apply variable icon, right? So I'm going to apply that variable and you're going to see it right here, this first text variable. Let's click it and you're going to see that that text shows up here. Now that that is been bound to this text field. So we have this text field and this text field is ascribed to that first text variable. Now, when we change that text to anything else, so I could say, hello, Alex, right? And then put an exclamation point. When I press return, then this is updated. So any other text fields that I have that are ascribed to that value. So I'm just going to say here, I'm just going to put in some other text. I'm going to put in some other text. So when this text has that variable, you see that it will be updated. And as I update that text from this singular location, so I'm going to say, hello, Paulo, right? It's going to update all of those instances. So this is a reference to this value, and we're going to ascribe that. Now, what we're going to do, I'm actually going to hop over here to typographic properties. So what we actually have here is a number of things. So I have line height. Let's put this in here, line height. And these are going to be some of the first ones that we're going to talk about. Let me just create that there, bring this down. And so when we think about typographic properties, right, we can begin to control the type that we're adding. So when you're designing, right, you're setting a font, right? You're setting the font weight, you're setting the line height. Maybe you're changing the font size. Maybe you're changing the letter spacing. So when you want consistency in your designs, you can control that consistency at the variable level. So we could say here, I'm just going to add in another little detail here so you can see the font size as well. So we're going to say font size. Just going to label this here. And don't worry, I'm going to be sending an updated community file at the end of the workshop. So if you're just starting and playing around, you'll get another copy there. So we're looking at the typography panel. When I click T, I'm going to press T. I'm going to type in some text on the canvas here. Once again, I'm going to say, hello, Alex. Now this text field, when I select it over here on the right, I can see the typography panel. That typography panel is going to allow me to change, once again, the font size, the font weight. So I have medium, semi-bold, bold, right? I have over here the size itself. I can make that larger, smaller, and I could change the line height. So if we have multiple lines, hello, Alex, how are you? Right? What I'm going to be able to do is adjust and control these properties at a variable level. So here we go. You'll see that I'm reducing this, I'm changing the weight. Now, every one of those properties that we see here, the way that it's being demonstrated in this visual, it's showing you those values already being applied. So what we can do is begin to create some of those variables to control this. So once again, let's start by creating a set where we can begin to think about the font itself. I'm going to click on the canvas. We're going to come over to local variables. I'm going to create a new collection, and I'm going to call this my type set. Here, I'm going to create a variable. This is going to be a string variable, and this string variable, I'm going to call my base underscore font underscore name. So this is going to be our base font name. And if we take a look at the text here, let's pick a typeface that we're going to work with. I'm going to choose Play Fair Display. Now, when typing that value into this field, we want to make sure that we're typing it correctly. So play, fair, display, right? Let's take a look at some of the other properties that we have here. We have semi-bold, so I can create another variable here. Now, these properties right here, if I go to my variable font axes, they can be expressed in another way. And this is a way that it's commonly expressed in cascading style sheets, CSS, or code. So what you could do is you can actually type in a weight value. So you'll notice that semi-bold is going to relate to 600, right? 700 is going to be bold. Up here, 800 is going to be extra bold. If we bring this down, medium is going to be 500. So there's different ways of expressing these values, and I'm going to rely on the number value here for expressing that weight. So let's create another variable. I'm going to choose number, and I'm going to say, font weight, and let's set a value of 500. So in order for us to see those being ascribed to the text that we're working with, I'm going to select my text field here. I'm going to choose a different font entirely, so then this way we can see it being applied. So here we have IBM Flex Mono. And when I click on that text field, I'm going to look for that apply variable. So I'm going to apply that variable there. Got a bunch of windows. I got to work on our window management. But here I can select that. And when I click, it's going to provide for me the string values that I have already created in my set. So I'm going to choose this base font. The value for that's going to be play fair display. And we're going to see that the base font name is now showing up right here. And then let's set that other value, our weight. Let's apply a variable. And you're going to see that now we have two different options, right? It's going to pull up both for us, those string values as well as that number value. So I'm going to set that font weight. Now, if that font weight is not available for that given font, it's going to cascade and use a value that makes the most sense. So you are going to see when I apply a number change here in my variable window, you'll see it update here as well. So if I choose 500, you're going to see that it's going to find the next available value in that font set. Some font faces are going to be incomplete in their set. Some are going to have more availability of font weights. So just be mindful of that. If I was to change the base font name to, let's say, Inter, right? And I could change this font weight to 800, you're going to see it reflected here. So once again, you might be thinking, well, why would I do it this way when I can just set it in the field? When you start thinking about product design, you start thinking about all the screens that you're creating, it helps to centralize this and create a single location for this. All right, so now let's apply another value. Here, let's create another number. And for this, I'm going to set my line height. Now, line height is something that we need to consider because we're currently limited in our fields and what we can apply. So I'm going to set here my line height. And what I'm going to do is I'm currently working, let's say I have 55 as my font size, or 56. I can increase that size. So let's set our line height to 56, and let's create another number and have this be our font underscore size. Now, once again, the naming of the variable as well as the value, right? This is like the property that we're working with, and this is the value. So let's set our font size to 56 and our line height to 56. I'm going to come here to my font size. I'm going to scroll down here. I'm going to apply the variable. Now you're going to notice that sometimes all the variable locations in typography in a slightly different location. So just kind of be mindful of where you're pulling those from. And you can see here, now I can see what's available to me for my font size. I can even begin to type that in, font for font size. And then you're going to see there's the value of 56. And my line height, there's the apply variable icon. This one is a little bit easier to access. I can click on it and choose line height. So these values are all here in this table. And what's great about this, once again, I'm going to duplicate this field. I'm going to say hello world. And then, I'm going to have like another text field here that just says, how ya doing, right? And you're going to see that we are controlling all three of these fields. So if I once again change this to play fair display, right, it updates them all. I changed that font weight to 400. I changed that line height. You'll notice that right now it's about 100% line height. If I increase that value by, like, let's say 8, it's going to open that up as well. So what we're doing is we're creating this centralized source of truth for the text that we're working with. So I already had somebody ask me, what's the difference between font styles and variables? It's a great question. I'm going to be covering that in a moment, but the short answer is the variables are kind of like all the primitive values. The font style will be, or the type style will be a composite, right? So we can have those primitive values being defined in the variables, but then the style itself will be the composite, wherein you're matching the font name, the font weight, the font size, the line height. That collectively together, that composite entity then becomes the type style, and they work in tandem with one another. So you think of the base properties are selected there. So you can have one variable kind of control one aspect of multiple styles. So hopefully that helps answer that question. We're going to get into that in just a little bit. So let's kind of dig into that right now. When you start to think about typographic styles, I have a visual here that is currently linked out from the material design system guidelines, right? And so here you can begin to see that those styles, right, have what they refer to as tokens, what we refer to as variables, right? So we have here that value of font weight being 400, right? We have that value of the font itself being Roboto, the typeface. Here we have like the font size. So when you think about ascribing those values, right, these are the individual pieces. Then when you add them together, they then become a style. So I'm going to head over here, and because we're still talking about the style, let's build up that composite. So you'll notice that I can still ascribe a variable to letter spacing. Let's go ahead and do that as well. So sometimes when you're working with display text or very large text, you want a little bit tighter letter spacing. Sometimes when you're working with small text, you want to open it up a little bit. Sometimes when you're working with text that is reversed out, so white text on a black background, you also want to open up that letter spacing. Another term for that is also known as tracking. So let's create another variable. Let's go in here and we're going to put in the word tracking, or we could say letter spacing. And some of you out there are going to be like, hey, what's the difference between kerning and letter spacing? Kerning is in between two letters. Letter spacing is across all of the letters in the text field. And you might be asking, when do I kern? When do I letter space? Generally, the answer is kern consistently or not at all. So in this systemized approach, what we want to do is we just want to rely on the typography, the font file, the typographer's definition of the kerning to just be applied. And then what we're going to be more concerned with is the letter spacing itself. So here I'm going to change this letter spacing. Let's put in like a value of 2, and we can apply it to our text fields. So here I selected those 3 text fields. I'm going to apply that variable. I'm going to apply the letter spacing. You see that's still a bit open. Once again, if you lose track of where your variables are, they're going to be over here. We're going to open up their variables, and then we can reduce that down. So here You can see I can use the arrow keys on my keyboard to expand that up or down, and I can make adjustments to the letter spacing for this type. Now, thinking about a style, as I mentioned, a style is going to be a composite of all of these values. Let's create our first style. So I'm going to come over here. I'm going to select this text here. You're going to see we have our typography variables applied. Just so you know, there's a few others within the type settings. You can go into basics. You can apply paragraph spacing. So that's the spacing between every hard return. That can be applied as a variable, as well as paragraph indent. So paragraph indent would be the starting of any new paragraph. You can change the indent spacing on that as well. So these are kind of lesser known values that some folks might not be aware of. I just wanted to highlight those there. What we're going to do next is we're going to select that text field. I'm going to come over here. I'm going to come up. Whenever you see those four dots, that icon represents a style. Once again, one of the main differences between a style definition and a variable definition, a variable is kind of like one step more of a primitive, right? So we're setting those individual values, and then the style is a composite. So when I go here, I can create a new text style. We're going to give that a name. So this name could be, my headline text. I'm going to call this headline. And what's it for? You can write in a bit of a description. You can have more options here as well. As you're creating the style, you can be more, you can surface what are going to be the components of that. So what is this for? This is for headlines. And then we're going to create that style. Now that I've created that style, when I click on the canvas, I can see the text style that is currently available in this file. So when I add in new text, you're going to see that it's pulling in that style outright. And if I click into that style, or if I make any adjustments, I will see the variables contained within it. So hopefully that answers your question, that the style itself is going to be a composite. So if I want to use these variables across different other styles, let's say I want consistency in the font size, but I might want to change the the font face itself. That might be something else that I change. All right. So I see a question. Is there a list of property names? The one thing that I will encourage you all to do, especially if you're new to Figma, is make sure you turn on your property labels. So otherwise, when you're designing in Figma, you're not going to see as many fields as you would normally. But when I click here in this visual menu, I can enable property labels, and then you will see more of those property labels surfaced as you're working and you're selecting and working on things. And so I know that someone's saying it seems like double the work to achieve the same result. I'll kind of explain other ways that this can be kind of scaled. So effectively, what we're trying to do here is that as you're working, let me go here, right? I have headline. This headline has that composite. These other text fields, they're using the variables themselves, but by updating headline, I can make some changes. I also noted someone made a question earlier that they might prefer to use a percentage line height value, right? So you'll notice that we're using a line height that is explicitly sort of referencing the font size. If I wanted to, I can create a style, or I can edit the style definition, right? To kind of break that limit. So let's say if I didn't want to express the line height as a variable, I can come in here and express it as a percentage, allowing me to have these mixed values. So while Figma is continuously updating and we may see percentage values, I'm not going to make any promises right off the bat, but while we might have the ability to express percentages in the variables field in the future, this can be a pretty good stopgap that might also provide you the ability to update that in the future, wherein you're going to have this sort of composite of the variables with the line height as well. Okay, so one of the reasons that working with variables is going to like support you is even just thinking about typographic scale. I'm going to show an example that I'm using to manage typographic scale in a file where I'm scribing kind of like the type sizes that I'm easily working with. Being able to have your type, being able to look at your font sizes and control them sort of at a glance allows you to better manage these sorts of things. So you can see that as I'm working here, this is in a separate file, I'm able to better at a glance adjust and manage some of these values. So paragraph spacing, tracking, I can go to that sort of single source of truth to have more control over it. This typographic scale link here links out to the material design style guidelines that can help you better understand, sort of the benefits of creating that in this way. So another thing that I do want to demonstrate for you here is that the value of working with variables within Figma is also going to support developer handoff. A lot of times we're working in Figma with teams. We want to be demonstrate the intentionality of our work. So if I was to use the text here, so I'm going to say hello world, right? So we have our text field. You're going to see that it has a typography enabled. Now, when I go into dev mode, these values are going to be surfaced to the developer, to myself in two different ways. When I select this text field here, you're going to see that there's going to be code and there's going to be properties. So when I go to code, I'm going to choose CSS here, and you're going to see that the variables that we defined are then going to be passed through to the developer. So they can not only see the value that we're using, right? They're inspecting this text field. The text is going to be, throughout your interface. It's going to be throughout your designs. They're going to have a much better insight into that level of consistency. They're going to want to care more about that variable name. So then this way they know what to choose and they're not picking and choosing at random as they're working through your design. When I take a look at this in properties mode, right, you're going to see here too that it's also going to be surfaced using those variable names, which is going to be much more common and understandable for them. If you're going to be working with developers or if you're working within a given system, as you're building this out, you're going to want to think about the naming structure that's going to work best for both you and the developer. And this can also be copied here as well. So what we're thinking about and what we're attempting to do here is to sort of help eliminate guesswork, right? As you're designing, you're basically taking these objects, you're taking your type, you're creating consistency. You're also trying to remove an overburden of options, right? You just want to bring it down in size. So when I select this text here, as the developer, when I click on the canvas, the developer too can get an at a glance of the variables. They can see the same thing that you're building out as the designer. So when they go to the typeset, they can see the variables that have been defined in this file, as well as how that's being expressed. And as a design editor, you can get an insight into what they see as well. So this is going to help you look through and make sure that your designs are going to be consistent. So is this something for color? Yes, this absolutely does work with color. Today's focus was primarily typography variables, but here itself, let's say if I have a color that I've created, if I go to libraries, what I can do is I can click plus, and here I can choose for that color to either be a variable or a style. Once again, the same thing here is true for color, wherein the color itself can be a primitive variable or it can be a composite style. So here I'm going to set this as base red. I'm going to create that variable right there. So when I go to my variables, I can go to my first example and I can see that that color that I've created. It's currently in this collection. And I've addressed collections earlier. Collections are going to be your way of controlling and organizing your variables so you can create a color set. So I could say brand colors. I can create that variable. Let's say that this is our, base brand red. Let's say I have another variable that is our base brand black. Let's choose like an off black. And one thing that we haven't yet talked about is the way that variables can reference other variables. So within here, I can have another color. And so I could say this as, surface background. And so instead of just the color being defined here, I can actually reference the base red. So if anything happens to this color, right, if our red changes, right, this should then update when we're working on it. And that's actually the wrong red. Let's go brand brace red. There we go. So when I make updates to that red, that will then cascade down to other values. Or if I then want to say, hey, the background is now going to be based off of the black, right? We can then alias that value here. So yeah, variables are like tokens. It's the exact same. It's a very similar concept. The reason that they're labeled variables in Figma is just that it's more of a encompassing term. But the way that we're working with variables in Figma is exactly as if you were working with tokens. So even here, let's say I have another variable that is a string. I can have another like font name. So let's say, let's say, so we have our base font. We can choose a different variable name. So I can say like headline font. And if I want, instead of just the string value, I can actually reference the base font name. So then that'll cascade down. So if I have an alternative, this is enter, then that will then reference it. So exactly what you were saying, like with the percentages right now isn't going to be a valid field option. What you want to do is we're going to express those as regular numbers currently. All right. So the last concept that we did want to talk about today before we kind of demonstrate a few more examples is going to be modes. So as we're kind of building this out here, right? So you can see we have our base font, right? We have our font weight, we have our line height. We can begin to make these more specific and we can have additional values for them. Another thing that we can do is we can begin to group and organize our selection. So I'm going to create a new group and this could be called, our default headline, and then we can begin to create more variables and then also have those grouped out. So if we think our base headline is here, we can add in another number. So this could be, let's say, our H2 font size, right? And then that font size could be smaller. So right here we have like our base font size. This might be our H1. And you can easily go through, just double click, and you can begin to edit those values as well. So I'm going to choose like 48. So here, once again, when we're working with our type, we can change the value that's being used here. So let's say this font size, we could then choose the alternate font size, which is going to be a spell down from there. And once again, just to kind of show you how those groups can be used, oftentimes I will use groups to organize the different. So here I have my display, here I have my title, here I have my header, here I have my header two. The way that I'm demonstrating, I'm aliasing certain values so I don't have to type them over and over again. So here with my header, I'm using my base font. Here for the header two, also using the base font, right? And then the difference between the header and the header two might be the font size, where I'm going from a font size 80 down to font size 56, down to font size 28, essentially creating that scale of text. And I personally will use groups to manage those values. And then I will have global values. So here you'll see that I have a group within my typography collection that will show enter as the base font for my sans serif text. And then I might have IBM Plex serif as my serif text. Editing this value to play fair display will then cascade to any other options that are using that sans serif. Absolutely. So here, when I go to my local variables, what I can do is, let's say I want to create a new variable. I'm going to call this a string. I can even use kind of like / syntax to drive and create another headline. So what I might do is say h2 / font size, and then it will create an h2 group. Or if I have a number of variables, I can actually rearrange these as well. I can move this up and out. Let me double click. I could say H2, right? So there's my font size. Let's say that that is 40. And I can just create another variable within that group. So I can say line height, and that line height could be, let's say, 48. Now, if I wanted to create another group, right, I can type in a string value, and let's say I'm going to have another font size for H3. This is the way that I do it. I'll just go like, H3 / font size, right? And you'll see this then becomes a subgroup, but you can rearrange and manage them in this way. So I want to show the flexibility of organizing these things. So even here, this H2 font size, I could drag it over to H2, and then it's now here. If you need to delete a variable, you can delete it there. So there's actually really nice click and drag management within the groups themselves. So yeah, the group name eyebrow, an eyebrow is like text that might exist above a headline, if that makes sense. All right, cool. So once again, with groups, I could just go to all variables, right? And when I'm viewing all variables, I can see the structure. So once again, if I need to rename this, I could say, H1, let's do lowercase, H2, H3, right? And then I can begin to see those values. So I can go here down to 32. Now, as you're working on this, you can also scope your values. So you notice that when we're applying the variables to a field. So when you're thinking about the font size, when you're thinking about the name, here you can change the scope so then this variable only becomes on font family, right? So now I will only see that variable show up when I create a variable here with font family. So you'll come and I'll see that this base font will only be available there. It won't show up in other fields that will also accept string variables. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about modes. I'm going to give you kind of a brief overview of how they work. In order to access modes, you need to make sure that your file is on an education team or a pro team or higher. So you're not going to have access to other modes if you're just in a starter team or working in your drafts. So here I'm going to create some text. I'm going to say example headline. I'm going to use the style that we're working with right here. So we have our headline style, right? So there we go. We have our headline style. Now I'm going to go to my variables and we're going to see that these are the primary variables that we're working with, right? And I'm going to come over here and I'm going to create a new variable mode. Now, modes can be used for just kind of like creating an alternate version. You could have a mode for dark mode. You can have a mode for a mobile device, right? So you can use it for responsiveness. So let's call this our, let's say that this is going to be our main window. So let's say laptop. I spell laptop correctly, laptop. And let's say mobile. So there we go, laptop and mobile. And so our base font name, right, is going to be Playfair Display, right? Both of these are kind of pulling from our font. Let's say if we want that global font, right, we can easily do that by creating a new variable. I'm going to call this a string. I'm going to say global underscore font face. I'm going to call this one Playfair Display. I'm going to have it here as well. And so here, instead of manually typing this out every time, we can reference our global font face. So I can click and same thing here. I can reference global font face. So once again, this is aliasing, and then this allows you to just like eliminate redundancy. You can kind of reference that global value. So here for laptop, let's say our font size, I'm going to move that up. Our font size is 56. For mobile, we're going to bring it down in size. Let's change it to something noticeable. So when we do the demonstration here, we can see how that works. So the font weight here is let's say that's maybe 500. Let's say we go down to 400 with mobile. And then here, the line height that's going to be paired with our font size is also going to be brought down. I'm going to change that to 32. And then the letter spacing, we're actually going to go to 0. And we can already see that we're basically setting the base font name there as well. So we basically have two different modes being applied. Let's create another variable here. Let's create a color variable so we can see how this works. So we're going to say, text color, right? And then we're going to create another variable and we're going to set this as background color. So we're going to set our laptop text color to be black and our background color to be white. And then let's say when we're going to mobile, for some reason, we're switching into dark mode. Only going to show this, the purposes of this example here. So the text color will be white and the background will be dark. So the mode is going to allow you to have almost like a different theme associated with the thing that you're designing. So you'll see that I have this headline here. I'm going to draw a frame around it and I'm going to move this here. This frame, I'm going to set that fill color of the frame. We're going to use a variable and that variable is going to be the BG color. So it's here under H1, right? And let's set the text color. We're going to set that to a variable as well. There's the H1 text color. So not only are we relying on this style and all of these variables to generate this, but now we can come over here to the appearance palette and we can apply a variable mode. And you'll see when I go here to typeset, we could choose laptop or mobile. When I click on mobile, you'll see, there we go. Our text is smaller. Let's align that to the center. Our text is smaller and the background's different. And then we can kind of go back to laptop and there it is. It's a little bit larger. So if I was to have two of these frames, I could set this frame to mobile. And if I move the text between the two, the styling associated with it will change. So it'll change its theme as you go from one to the other. So let's say this is our mobile design. When I bring this over here, you're gonna see that that's much smaller, and here it's much larger. So you can create up to 4 modes as you're kind of developing and working on this. So here's our laptop properties, here's our mobile property. These properties can also be swapped out when prototyping. I'll also show you here. Let's just duplicate this headline, bring it over here. I'm going to turn on dev mode. And even within dev mode, you can see the mode that's kind of like available for you. So like as they want to inspect and understand those values, the mode will also come into play in surfacing those designs to the developer, right? And so ideally what we're thinking about here is not just, like, oh, I need to do this every single time, right? It's not like, oh, I clicked on dev mode way too many times. The thing that you need to consider here is that this is going to be at scale. This is making an entire system, right? So this is going to be like working on files over time. You can always publish these files. Let me go over here. If I publish this library, so you'll see, what do I have? I have my typeset. I have my first example, all of these things. I could choose what I want to add, right? Let's publish. So now when I create a new file in Figma, I can go here. I can find the library that I just published. Let's say, what was that called? Typography. Variables. There's my typography variables. I can add that to this file. And now when I put text in here, right, I can pull up the style. And once again, that style will have all of those variables, right? And so if I'm working with other people and I don't want them to break some of those base styles, right, they can see it here. And now if you're a designer and you're an editor and you're working in another file, you realize you have to make a tweak or publish out a new edit, you can go to that style definition. It'll take you right to the other file that you're working from and be able to make those changes. So what this is about creating something that is reusable, that is scalable and understandable for developers to work with. All right. So any questions, Alex?
So many questions, Miggy. I tried to stack rank them based on the number of times we had heard these questions.
Cool.
But yeah, go for it.
All right. So still stuck between textiles and typography variables. Typography variables are inside of a textile, right? So they're little pieces that you're then use. So the textile itself is a composite. So exactly as we're kind of like demonstrating here, a style, this is the style, you give it a name, and it's composed of those variables that are within it. Let's see, if is it better for a small project to use just styles or create variables? So this is at your discretion, right? Once again, the value of having those variables, especially if you're going to be working with a developer and you're like working on like naming conventions, it's essentially a way to get organized and consistent. And then if you're going to be make changes down the road, so you saw the way that I can reference a global font variable, I just change it in that one location, and then that change proliferates throughout my document where applicable. So that's all about working the same way that you might on the web, where you would have CSS definitions. With CSS, the purpose of that is cascade. So you define something at the top and then it cascades down unless those other parts are overwritten. So it's about having the same structure the way that you would in developing something in a digital product or a website, and having that structure here in Figma. And sometimes, like I think it's like a good entry point to just getting into that level of consistency, because it can be easy if you're just using the font picker to, have to do like, you're over creating so much work for yourself. If you're designing one screen, you could just use the font picker, whatever you want. If you're just riffing on a design, if you're designing hundreds of screens, right? Anytime you go to update that, it could be very laborious if you aren't using variables. So is there a recommended nomenclature for variables? Any best practices to facilitate handoff? So in this workshop today, we're kind of focused on just kind of creating them and understanding where they are. The best way that I would recommend is take a look at the material guide design style guidelines. So I have a link here and I have a link to the type tokens. When you take a look at how others organize their variables, they organize them based off of the tasks that they perform, not necessarily the way that they look, because the way that they look may change. So my recommendation on that is to think of the task that is being done by that piece of type. Is it a headline? Is it body text? And then begin to think about that structure and how it works with the other folks that you're working with. If you have your own sort of way of doing it, making sure that it's understandable by others. So my recommended nomenclature there is just things that are scalable, focus on the tasks of the text, and think about how others are going to understand and work with that, as well as look to existing design systems that may be documented publicly to understand how other teams are communicating that. Because if you want a job at Google, right, you're going to have to work with that design system. So familiarizing yourself with how they articulate their variables is going to be very beneficial. So is it possible to create styles? Yes, you can make styles using variables. I already walked through that earlier. Um, so I want to know if different variables are applied automatically when scaling or downscaling. Downscaling. Does it work similarly to auto layout? So the thing that I want to identify here is there's a difference between resizing and scaling. Resizing would be like if you're resizing a window where you're just kind of reorganizing how things are moving. Using the scale tool in Figma, what I would recommend, I actually don't know how the scale tool would affect the variable, but it's not going to override the variable. So I believe if you use the scale tool, the text itself will still be there. Let's take a quick look and let's try that out, see what actually happens there. So if I have this and I press the K key, right, it's going to scale up. But what it's doing here is it's overriding the variable. It's not going to overwrite the variable, but basically we just lost the association of the font size. So Figma wants to do what you're trying to do, but then it's going to break the connection to the variable that you're working with. So when I change the line percentage, do I break the code or the design system? You can apply it to the style and have it as percentage. You won't be able to add in a percentage value currently in the variables panel. So, as I mentioned earlier in the workshop, there's different ways to express these things. So like line height is currently expressed as a number, but it can also be expressed as a percentage. The variables panel just doesn't support percentages yet. So if you want to use percentage based line height, so that's line height that's going to change based off of the font size. So if line height is 100% and your font size is 16, that means the line height is 16 and the font size is 16. So you can use the regular variable for that. the regular value for that in the variables panel, the percentage, maybe you use it in the composite style if you're overly reliant on percentage, and then that will then update whenever the font size updates. So that being a relative unit of measure. So since variable composites can be created using styles in Figma, how can we export them to code efficiently? So what I would say is like, take a look. The way that Figma is designed is for that handoff. Um, so like that handoff and the way that it's expressed, I know that there's different plugins that will allow you to kind of get the variables out of here, different APIs that allow you to get them out. The way that that is going to be expressed in code, it's basically doing its best job to surface both the variable name as well as, so once I go to CSS here, you're going to see that there's the variable name right there. And then there's going to be the variable value, right? So it's all expressed. It's definitely designed for that visibility. And once again, a developer working on here will be able to kind of see those values here by clicking on the canvas. When you're in dev mode, you can effectively change certain parameters on how these values get surfaced. So I can even change those units to rem values. And even though I've been explicitly setting them as font size, right, they will then be expressed as rem for the developer. Let's take a last look. Can you have too many variables moving the CSS site speed-wise? I say you can actually have quite a lot. So like even here in this file, like, I'm really, like I'm indexing on a lot. I've seen some very, very heavy files. There is an upper bound limit. I don't think we kind of surface what that limit is, but I guarantee you it's in the like tens of thousands of variables. So I think you can really put it through its grace. All right. So that's all for today. Once again, thank you all for joining us. It has been a pleasure. I know for those of you who might still be relatively new to Figma or new to some of these concepts, it can feel a bit complex. So feel free to rewatch this when we share this out. I appreciate y'all for joining me today. Thank you, Alex, for supporting these live streams, dropping those questions in the chat. Y'all have been a fantastic crowd. Thank you. Thank you.